Laughter erupted around them. Some scoffed, others whispered in amusement. The idea of Richard Stone hiring a mere delivery girl as his private chef was absurd. Leila took a half-step back, eyes narrowing. This had to be a joke. But when she met his gaze, there was no mockery, only unwavering certainty. The air thickened. The weight of the room pressed down on her, dozens of eyes waiting for her reaction. And then, before she could stop herself, the words escaped her lips. 5 times. The laughter stopped. A few people gasped. The banker, still blotting at his ruined suit, nearly choked. Richard arched a brow, intrigued. "Are you negotiating with me?" Leila straightened, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. If this was an opportunity, she wasn't going to let it slip away. "If you want me to leave my job at Oriental Flavor, make it worth my while." A pause. Then, to the shock of everyone in the room, Richard let out a low, amused chuckle. 4.5. Leila inhaled sharply. She hadn't expected him to actually counter. The ballroom felt impossibly quiet. The soft melody of a distant violin played in the background, a stark contrast to the tension in the air. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Fine." And just like that, a billionaire and a delivery girl had struck a deal in the middle of a high-society gala, under the stunned, disbelieving stares of everyone around them. But neither Richard nor Leila knew then. This was only the beginning of something far greater than either of them could have ever imagined. In the heart of the city, where skyscrapers reflected a million twinkling lights onto the cobblestone streets below, an extravagant gala was in full swing at the most exclusive hotel in town. The soft clinking of crystal glasses, polite laughter, and the subtle aroma of expensive perfumes intertwined with the air of wealth and power. Richard Stone stood in the center of it all, a man in his mid-30s with an air of quiet authority. His tailored suit fit his tall frame flawlessly, and yet, if you looked closely, there was an emptiness behind his sharp gaze, a dull indifference. Women in designer gowns fluttered around him, praising his watch, his latest billion-dollar acquisitions, his influence. But to him, it was all just meaningless noise. He had attended countless parties like this, filled with artificial smiles and soulless conversations. Richard took a slow sip of his whiskey, searching for a discreet way to make his exit without seeming impolite. And then, a piercing scream shattered the polished veneer of the evening. Across the grand ballroom, a distinguished man in a pristine white suit stood frozen, his chest and sleeves now drenched in deep red fruit juice. Gasps echoed, followed by scattered laughter. Richard turned his gaze. Standing before the humiliated banker was a petite young woman, her dark hair hastily tied back, her face pale with shock. A delivery bag dangled from one hand. Leila. She had just accidentally spilled an entire glass of juice on one of the most powerful men in the city. Her fingers clutched a napkin, hands trembling as she scrambled to clean the mess. But her attempts only made it worse. Murmurs spread through the room like wildfire. A woman in a $1,000 gown sneered. "She's probably never even seen a suit like this up close before." Leila clenched the napkin tighter. She didn't need to turn around to know they were all watching, judging. A delivery girl in the middle of high society's elite. An intruder. A security guard approached, his grip firm as he grabbed her arm. "You don't belong here!" Leila tried to pull away, but he was stronger. Then a voice, measured and authoritative, cut through the tension. "Let her go." Silence. Every head in the room swiveled toward Richard Stone. The guard hesitated, then immediately released Leila. The banker scowled. "Richard, don't tell me you're defending this girl." But Richard wasn't listening. His gaze remained fixed on her, the woman standing amidst a sea of wealth and arrogance, her face burning with embarrassment, yet her spine straight with defiance. "What's your name?" Leila hesitated, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. "Leila." Something shifted in Richard's expression. His gaze flicked to the logo on the bag she was holding, recognition flashing across his face. "You work for Oriental Flavor?" She gave a wary nod. Richard's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. Oriental Flavor, an unassuming little restaurant hidden in a side alley, serving the best yakisoba he had ever tasted. "Don't tell me, you're the one who makes the yakisoba?" Leila blinked, caught off guard. "It's my grandmother's recipe. I just help out." A moment of realization dawned over Richard. This girl, this small, seemingly insignificant delivery girl, was behind the dish he had been obsessed with for months. Everything else, the party, the women vying for his attention, the empty conversations, vanished. "I need a cook," he said, his voice steady. The entire room reeled. Leila's breath hitched. "Excuse me? I'll pay you 4 times what you make now. Be my personal chef." The morning sun rose over the towering skyline, its golden light reflecting off the glass buildings, casting long, sharp shadows across the bustling streets below. But for Leila, today felt unlike any other. She was no longer standing in her grandmother's tiny, cozy kitchen, where the rich aroma of sizzling spices filled the air. Today, she was walking into Stone Enterprises, one of the largest financial empires in the country. The marble floors gleamed beneath her feet, and the air smelled of expensive cologne and freshly printed contracts. People in tailored suits moved with purpose, speaking in hushed, businesslike tones, their gazes never once landing on her. She clutched the strap of her bag tightly, feeling like an outsider in a world she didn't belong to. But there was no turning back. She had accepted the job, no matter how insane it seemed. The elevator doors slid open, revealing the top floor of the building. And there it was, a kitchen unlike anything Leila had ever seen. It was enormous, with sleek marble countertops, elegant wooden cabinetry, and cutting-edge appliances that looked as though they had never been touched. The space felt sterile, almost too perfect, nothing like the warm, chaotic kitchen she was used to. And standing there, casually leaning against the counter with an air of quiet amusement, was Richard Stone. He was as composed as ever, impeccably dressed, his piercing gaze fixed on her like a man evaluating a business prospect. "You're late," he observed, his voice cool and detached. Leila clenched her jaw, keeping her expression neutral. She didn't care who he was, or how rich he might be. She knew how to cook the first test. Richard folded his arms. "Go ahead." Leila inhaled deeply. She walked to the counter, scanning the meticulously arranged ingredients. Everything was high-end: pristine vegetables, premium cuts of beef, and imported spices. But she didn't need luxury ingredients to make good food. All she needed was skill, instinct, and a little bit of heart. The oil in the pan sizzled as she dropped in the beef, the rich aroma filling the air almost instantly. She worked quickly, moving with practiced ease, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables blending with the sound of bubbling sauce. Everything was going smoothly, until a sharp, overpowering scent hit her nose. Leila glanced down at the pan. In her concentration, she had added too much soy sauce. A thick silence fell over the room. Richard picked up a pair of chopsticks, plucked a bite from the plate, and placed it in his mouth. He chewed thoughtfully, then set the chopsticks down with deliberate slowness. Leila held her breath. Finally, a faint smirk played on his lips. Not a kind one, but one full of unspoken amusement. "Have you ever been to the ocean?" Leila frowned. Richard leaned back slightly, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "Because this tastes exactly like it." A wave of embarrassment surged through her. She had messed up on her first day. But before she could react, the kitchen door swung open. A sharply dressed man entered. His suit was immaculate, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. Paul Whitmore, Richard's financial advisor. He approached, taking in the scene with barely veiled disdain. "Richard," he said, his tone clipped, "what the hell is this?" His gaze flicked to the plate on the counter, then to Leila, as if assessing something beneath his standards. "You actually think hiring a street cook is a good business decision?" Without waiting for an answer, he turned to Leila, his expression utterly unimpressed. "Tell me, have you ever served high-profile clients before, or do you just sell food to factory workers on street corners?" The words stung. Leila straightened. She didn't owe this man an explanation. But she could do something better. She could prove him wrong. Without a word, Leila reached for her apron, tying it tightly around her waist. This time she wasn't just cooking, she was making a point. She selected her ingredients carefully, moving with precise, confident motions. The knife danced across the cutting board, slicing vegetables into delicate, even pieces. The pan heated, releasing a soft, welcoming sizzle. The fragrance of caramelized onions and seared beef began to fill the air. Not overpowering, but balanced. Perfect. Richard watched, his interest piqued as Leila immersed herself in the process. 15 minutes later, she placed a new dish in front of him and Paul. It wasn't plated with excessive flair or needless decoration, just simple, honest food, presented exactly as it should be, inviting and undeniably appetizing. Richard was the first to move. He picked up his chopsticks, took a bite. Then, without a word, he put them down and turned to Paul. Paul hesitated, then reluctantly took a forkful. The moment the food touched his tongue, his expression shifted. A long silence stretched between them. Leila folded her arms, waiting. Finally, Richard spoke, his tone laced with amusement. "You're stubborn." Leila lifted her chin slightly. "I'm just doing my job." Paul didn't say a word, but he didn't argue either. Leila had won. And that meant she belonged here. Whether Richard or anyone else was ready to accept that or not. The city glittered in the twilight, its skyline bathed in hues of gold and crimson. Inside the towering glass structure of Stone Enterprises, a different kind of tension simmered beneath the polished elegance of an exclusive dining hall. Tonight was no ordinary evening. A long mahogany table stretched across the candle-lit room, set with the finest china and adorned with flickering glass sconces. The air buzzed with quiet conversation, laughter, and the distinct clinking of wine glasses. Seated around the table were some of the most influential investors in the country, men and women whose words had the power to shape entire industries. And in the kitchen, Leila stood frozen for a moment, staring at the ingredients laid out before her. She hadn't signed up for this. She had spent the past few weeks proving herself in Richard's private kitchen, dealing with his insufferable smirks, dodging Paul's disapproving stares, and wrestling with the overwhelming sense of unfamiliarity in this world of wealth. But now, she was being asked to cook for millionaires, people who had spent their lives indulging in five-star dining, people who would scrutinize every detail of her food. And Richard, he had barely given her a warning. She exhaled sharply, rolling up her sleeves. There was no time for doubt. Her hands moved on instinct, chopping, seasoning, sautéing. The rich aroma of caramelized onions and garlic filled the kitchen, blending with the delicate fragrance of fresh herbs. She worked swiftly, pouring all of her focus into perfecting the dish. Richard had placed his trust in her. Whether it was reckless or calculated, she didn't know. But she wasn't about to fail him. Minutes later, the dishes were plated and sent out. Leila remained in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, her heartbeat an erratic rhythm. Through the glass panel, she caught glimpses of the guests lifting their forks, exchanging glances, pausing mid-bite. Then came the first nods of approval, a murmur of appreciation. The subtle shift in their posture, the way they leaned in, discussing the flavors, savoring each bite. Richard sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, but when his gaze flickered toward the kitchen, something in his eyes told her he already knew she would succeed. Even Paul, who had spent days doubting her, had to acknowledge it. He lowered his glass, exhaling through his nose, before giving Richard a begrudging nod. Leila had just won over billionaires with nothing but a plate of food. By the next morning, whispers had taken root. Stone Enterprises, a place built on finance, was now filled with gossip about her. Employees stole glances whenever she walked through the halls. Conversations hushed when she passed by. A few bolder ones openly speculated. Why is she still here? Did you see how Richard looks at her? He's never hired a personal chef before. Why her? Leila tried to ignore it, but the weight of their stares followed her like shadows. Richard, on the other hand, was unfazed. If he noticed the rumors, he didn't show it. He carried on as he always did. Calm, confident, effortlessly in control. But the world around them wasn't blind. And neither was Miranda. She arrived unannounced. The doors to Richard's private floor swung open with a kind of arrogance only the truly privileged possessed. Tall, poised, dressed in a fitted designer suit that accentuated every calculated movement. Miranda Foster walked in as if she owned the place. Her platinum blonde hair cascaded over her shoulders, her heels clicking against the polished floors with precision. Leila didn't need an introduction. Even without knowing her name, she knew exactly who Miranda was. She recognized the way she moved, the casual yet intentional possessiveness as her manicured fingers traced the edge of Richard's desk, the soft curve of her lips masking something sharper underneath. This wasn't just a woman from Richard's past. This was a woman who had never truly left. Miranda's gaze landed on Leila, scanning her with the efficiency of someone sizing up a competitor. Then, a slow, almost pitying smile spread across her face. So, her voice was honey-smooth, dripping with condescension. This is the new help Richard hired? Leila didn't flinch. She had been underestimated her entire life. This was nothing new. Still, she let the silence stretch between them, refusing to rise to the bait. Miranda's smile didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something, irritation in her perfectly lined eyes. You must be enjoying yourself, Miranda continued, her voice laced with fake warmth. I imagine working for Richard must be quite the experience. He can be generous with people he finds amusing. The insinuation was clear. Leila wasn't here because of her skill. She was here because she was some fleeting source of entertainment, a passing amusement in Richard Stone's otherwise structured life. But Miranda had made a mistake. She thought Leila was someone who could be shaken. Leila tilted her head slightly, the corner of her lips curving. Not in a smile, but something dangerously close. You seem very interested in my job, she mused, her tone light, almost teasing. Are you looking for a position here too? Miranda's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Leila wasn't playing defense. She was playing offense. A flicker of tension passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of something deeper. This wasn't just about Leila's presence in Richard's life. This was about control. Miranda had expected a meek, intimidated girl. Instead, she had found someone who wouldn't back down. Just as she was about to speak again, the door behind them opened. Richard. His presence shifted the air in the room. He didn't ask why Miranda was there. He didn't need to. His gaze flickered between them, assessing, measuring. Miranda turned to him, her expression effortlessly shifting into something softer, more familiar. "Richard, darling," she purred, "we need to talk. Privately." But Richard didn't move. And then, in a way that was impossible to ignore, he looked past her, toward Leila. Something passed between them in that brief second. Something Miranda caught. And for the first time, her smile faltered. Leila didn't need confirmation. She had already won this round. But she also knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. The city skyline shimmered under the evening lights, casting reflections on the towering glass windows of Stone Enterprises. Inside, the hum of conversations and the rhythmic tapping of keyboards filled the air. Employees bustled about, discussing financial reports, stock market trends, and high-profile deals. But amidst the sea of tailored suits and calculated discussions, Richard Stone was about to make an announcement that would leave his entire team in disbelief. Standing in the center of his executive conference room, he tapped his fingers lightly against the polished table, watching as Paul Whitmore, his financial advisor, narrowed his eyes. The rest of the senior staff exchanged confused glances, shifting in their seats, waiting for him to speak. And then, with the same calm confidence that he used to close billion-dollar deals, Richard declared his intention to participate in an upcoming charity cooking competition. The room fell silent. Paul was the first to react, his disbelief so obvious that he actually took off his glasses and rubbed his temples. It was an absurd idea. Richard Stone, a man who had likely never cracked an egg in his life, whose idea of cooking consisted of choosing between Michelin-starred restaurants, was now planning to stand behind a stove, competing against real chefs. To Paul, it wasn't just ridiculous. It was a public relations nightmare. But Richard was unmoved. He had already made up his mind. And one person, Leila, was about to be dragged into the chaos. The training begins. When Leila first heard about Richard's decision, she thought he was joking. But then she saw his kitchen, completely stocked with ingredients, an apron draped over the counter, and Richard himself standing there with an infuriatingly casual expression, waiting for her to start. That was when she realized he was serious. The problem? Richard wasn't just bad at cooking, he was catastrophic. It started with the knife. The moment he attempted to dice an onion, he nearly sliced his finger off. Leila had barely turned away before she heard a sharp hiss of pain, followed by Richard inspecting a small cut on his hand, as if he couldn't quite believe it had happened. By the time she finished bandaging him, the onions were a disaster, some pieces too big, others practically pulverized. And that was just the beginning. The next day, she found him staring at a boiling pot of water as if it were a foreign object. When she asked what he was doing, he responded, completely serious, that he was waiting for the pasta to cook itself. Then there was the seasoning: salt, pepper, soy sauce. Richard didn't understand balance. He dumped everything in as if flavor could be measured in sheer quantity. The first bite he took was so salty that even he had to spit it out, eyes watering from the overwhelming brine. Leila laughed until her sides hurt. But Richard? He didn't get frustrated. He didn't throw his hands up and quit like she had expected. Instead, he smirked, wiped his mouth, and said, "Again." And that's when she realized. This wasn't a game to him. He wanted to get better. And for some reason, That simple fact unsettled her more than anything else. The day of the event arrived sooner than expected. The grand ballroom of the charity gala had been transformed into a high-end culinary battlefield. Spotlights gleamed down on stainless steel countertops, where contestants, including some of the city's most well-known chefs, were setting up their stations. And then there was Richard. Dressed in a crisp chef's jacket, standing with an air of practiced confidence, he looked like he belonged. But Leila knew better. Underneath that composed exterior, she could see the subtle tension in his shoulders, the slight shift in his stance as he scanned the competition. The timer started. Richard moved swiftly, not flawlessly, not without mistakes, but with purpose. He chopped with better control, stirred with more precision. At one point, he even adjusted the seasoning correctly, without her having to correct him. She found herself watching him closely, an unfamiliar sense of pride creeping into her chest. This was no longer about proving a point. He was actually trying. By the time the competition ended and the judges announced the results, the room held its breath. Second place. Not first, but not last either. For a man who had started out barely knowing how to hold a knife, it was a victory. And Leila saw it. The way Richard's lips curled slightly, the way his gaze flickered toward her as if seeking silent confirmation. She didn't say anything. She just smirked and nodded. Later that night, after the event had ended and the ballroom had emptied, Richard found her standing by the balcony, arms crossed as she stared out at the city lights. He approached without a word, his presence settling beside her like an unspoken invitation. And then, after a long pause, he spoke. "Let's open a restaurant." Leila's breath caught. She turned, expecting to see amusement in his expression, another one of his tests, another ridiculous challenge. But instead she found something she hadn't seen before. Sincerity. His gaze was steady, unreadable, yet undeniably serious. It wasn't just a passing thought. It was a plan, a real plan. And for the first time, Leila realized, this wasn't just about food. This was about them, a partnership, a risk, an entirely new chapter of both their lives. But was she ready to take it? That she still didn't know. The decision hung in the air like an unspoken promise, heavy with possibilities, and the kind of uncertainty that made Leila's stomach twist. A restaurant? Her restaurant. But the moment Richard had suggested it, something inside her recoiled. Not because she didn't want it, but because she knew what it meant. It meant stepping into a world she never belonged to. It meant working side by side with a man who was both infuriating and captivating in equal measure. And worst of all, it meant risking everything. For years, she had lived by a simple rule. Keep your world small, keep your heart guarded. She knew what happened when people like her dreamed too big. Reality had a cruel way of reminding them where they belonged. But Richard didn't play by those rules. When she hesitated, he didn't press. Instead, he offered her something unexpected, a compromise. The restaurant wouldn't be in the heart of the city, where the wealthy dined on overpriced dishes under chandeliers that cost more than most homes. It would be near her village, a place where people like her could experience good food without feeling out of place, where her grandmother's recipes could be served not as nostalgia, but as something worth celebrating. The idea took root before she even realized it, and before she could talk herself out of it, she found herself agreeing. The first sign that they were bound to clash came when the blueprints arrived. Richard, ever the businessman, had envisioned something sleek. Glass walls, modern lighting, an ambiance that whispered exclusivity. Leila took one look at the designs and felt her stomach drop. This wasn't a home. This wasn't a place where people would sit for hours, sharing stories over a bowl of steaming soup, where laughter would echo against wooden walls filled with warmth and history. This was a statement, a display of power and wealth, and it was everything she hated. The argument started small, sharp words exchanged over menus, over furniture choices, over whether or not people actually cared about high-end wine pairings. But soon, the tension boiled over. Leila, hands planted on the rough wooden counter of the unfinished kitchen, glaring at Richard as if willing him to see reason. Richard, standing with arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but his stubbornness unwavering. Neither of them was willing to back down. But deep down, beneath all the frustration and the clashing ideals, something else stirred. A dangerous kind of understanding. They were different. Opposites, even. But somehow that was what made it work. While Leila and Richard wrestled with their vision for the restaurant, something else was brewing. Miranda had not forgotten, nor had she forgiven. She watched from a distance, her nails tapping rhythmically against her champagne glass as she scrolled through the latest news articles. Leila's name was everywhere, her food, her talent, her proximity to Richard. It was unacceptable. So she did what she always did best. She planted a seed of doubt. Sabotage in the dark it started subtly. Rumors whispered into the right ears. Doubts about Leila's ability to run a restaurant. Claims that Richard was simply entertaining a fling, and that the business was nothing more than a vanity project. Then came the more calculated attacks. A surprise visit from a health inspector, tipped off by an anonymous source about supposed violations in the unfinished kitchen. Calls to suppliers, convincing them that the restaurant wasn't a safe investment. And then, the final blow. A fabricated news article questioning whether Leila had fabricated her background story entirely. Whether she was really the talented chef everyone believed her to be, or simply a convenient pawn in Richard Stone's game. The night before the restaurant was set to open, Leila found herself standing outside, staring at the article on her phone, her fingers curled so tightly around the device that her knuckles turned white. She knew exactly who was behind it. But what terrified her wasn't Miranda. It was the quiet voice in the back of her head that whispered, "What if people believe it?" The grand opening doubt lingered, like a stain she couldn't scrub clean. But then, the doors opened, and something incredible happened. People came, not because of the headlines or because of Richard's wealth, but because they believed in the food. The first customers hesitated as they stepped inside, taking in the warm, rustic ambiance. Nothing sleek, nothing cold. Just the rich scent of slow-cooked broth, the comforting sizzle of fresh ingredients meeting the pan, and the sound of conversations overlapping in a symphony of life. Tables filled. Orders rushed in faster than she could keep up with. She caught glimpses of her grandmother's smile from the corner of the room, a silent nod of approval that meant more than any critic's review ever could. And when she looked across the restaurant, past the crowd, she found Richard watching her. Not with amusement, not with victory, but with something deeper, something that made her stomach tighten and her chest feel impossibly light at the same time. She had won. And Miranda, for the first time in her life, she had lost. But if Leila thought this was the end of Miranda's games, she was about to be very, very wrong. The restaurant was thriving. Every table was filled. The scent of sizzling spices and slow-simmered broths wove through the air like an invitation, and laughter echoed against the wooden beams of the warmly lit dining hall. It was everything Leila had dreamed of, and more. But in the shadows, something sinister was unfolding. Miranda hadn't disappeared. She had been watching, waiting. And when the moment was right, she struck it started with a knock at the door. Sharp, official, unmistakably calculated. Leila had barely stepped out of the kitchen when she saw them. health inspectors, dressed in dark uniforms, their expressions cold and unreadable. They moved with precision, clipboard in hand, their eyes scanning the bustling restaurant with the detached scrutiny of men already convinced of a crime. Within minutes, everything unraveled. They combed through the kitchen, pulling open cabinets, inspecting storage areas, swabbing countertops. Then came the whispers. Violations, unsanitary conditions, food safety concerns. But Leila knew. She knew. The spotless surfaces, the carefully labeled ingredients, the fresh produce delivered just that morning. There was no way her restaurant had failed an inspection. And yet, by the time they were done, the verdict had already been decided. Closure. Effective immediately. The words were cold, final, inked onto a document that might as well have been a death sentence. Outside, news cameras had already arrived, as if someone had anticipated the scandal before it even happened. And that's when Leila saw her. Miranda. Standing at a distance, elegantly poised, her lips curving in the faintest hint of satisfaction. For the first time in her life, Leila felt helpless. She had worked her way up from nothing, spent years scrubbing dishes, learning recipes passed down through generations, struggling to keep herself and her grandmother afloat. And now, in one single calculated move, Miranda had tried to erase everything. She could have broken. She could have walked away. But giving up wasn't in her blood. That same night, as Richard met with his legal team, mapping out strategies and appeals, Leila took matters into her own hands. If she couldn't serve food inside the restaurant, she would take the restaurant to the people. By dawn, she was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, preparing orders like nothing had changed. The staff moved around her, confused but ready, as she packed meal after meal into carefully wrapped containers. The restaurant may have been closed, but that didn't mean the food had to stop. With a single post online, the plan was set in motion. Sabre de Leila isn't shutting down. If you can't come to us, we'll come to you. Delivery starts now. The response was instantaneous. Orders flooded in. Messages of support poured onto their social media pages. The community, her community, refused to let the restaurant die. Delivery drivers zipped through the city, carrying her dishes to every doorstep, every office, every hungry customer who wouldn't let a lie stop them from eating the food they loved. And Leila? She didn't stop moving. But while she fought in the kitchen, Richard was fighting his own battle. Something didn't add up. The timing, the speed, the certainty of the health inspectors. It had all been too perfectly executed. And that's when he saw it. A waiter, one of their newer hires, lingering near the storage area, phone in hand, typing something quickly before slipping it into his pocket. Richard didn't hesitate. He crossed the room in a heartbeat, his voice calm but edged with something sharp, something dangerous. The waiter froze, a second too long, a breath too deep. And that's when Richard knew. Within minutes, security footage confirmed it. Messages sent to an unknown number, photos taken of private documents, details about their plans leaked from inside. They had a spy, and Miranda had just made her first mistake. Richard didn't believe in revenge, but he did believe in justice. And Miranda had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Within hours, a private investigator was hired. Miranda had covered her tracks well, but money leaves trails. Bribed officials, fabricated violations, transactions traced to offshore accounts, all leading back to her. Richard didn't go to the authorities. He went to the media. And just like that, the very same press that had swarmed their restaurant days before was now outside Miranda's estate, cameras rolling, reporters demanding answers. Her empire, her reputation, was burning. And this time, there was no escape. By the time the restaurant was officially cleared to reopen, the line outside stretched for blocks. Customers weren't just coming back. They were coming back in force. The energy was different this time, stronger, as if the people weren't just here for the food, but for the story, for the fight they had all become a part of. Leila stepped into the kitchen, taking it all in, the chaos, the movement, the undeniable pulse of life that filled every corner of the space she had built. And across the restaurant, standing in his usual spot, was Richard. Watching. Waiting. The weight of everything that had happened sat between them, unspoken but understood. She exhaled slowly, gripping the counter just a little tighter than usual. Because she knew. Miranda may have lost this battle. But something told her. The war was far from over. The night air was thick with the scent of rain, lingering just at the edge of a storm. The city glowed beneath a blanket of golden streetlights, casting long shadows across the sleek skyline. Inside an elegant rooftop restaurant, Leila sat across from Richard, her hands curled around the stem of a wine glass she barely touched. This wasn't just another business dinner. She knew it the moment he had called. Knew it from the way he had waited for her at the entrance, his usual confidence laced with something softer. Something almost uncertain. For the past few months, their lives had been intertwined, through battles fought over menus, through late nights spent fixing disasters in the kitchen, through laughter shared over meals that never made it to the customers. But this was different. This wasn't about the restaurant. This was about them. The world around them faded. The soft hum of jazz, the flickering candlelight, the distant murmur of conversations. Richard's gaze was steady, but there was something in his expression, something raw, unguarded, a look she had never seen before. She felt it before he even spoke, felt it in the way his fingers brushed against the table's edge, as if reaching for something unseen. The words hung between them, invisible but undeniable. And suddenly, it was real. The subtle glances, the quiet understanding, the way her presence softened the sharp edges of his world, and how he, in return, made her believe in something she had never dared to before. But love. Love was dangerous, especially when it came from a man like him. Leila's world had always been simple. Hard work, survival, responsibility. And then there was Richard, born into wealth, a man who made decisions with the confidence of someone who had never needed to wonder if he could afford to fail. Their lives were too different. She didn't belong in his world, and he had no idea how to exist in hers. Doubt twisted in her chest as she stared at him, the weight of unspoken words pressing against her ribs. The answer should have been simple, but nothing about this was simple. By the time they stepped outside, the air had changed. Cameras flashed before she even had a chance to react. Voices rose above the city noise, calling out her name, calling out his. Reporters swarmed, hungry for a headline. Is this the new romance of the year? Leila, do you think you're a Cinderella story? Richard, what does your family think about you dating someone outside high society? The questions cut through her like cold steel, each one a reminder that her life was no longer her own. She had become a spectacle, and worst of all, she hadn't even agreed to anything yet. Richard moved instinctively, placing himself between her and the crowd, his hand hovering near hers, as if to shield her from the chaos. But the damage was done. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was a scandal. Back home, the small kitchen smelled of warm broth and fried dough, the comforting scents of her childhood. But for the first time in her life, it didn't feel safe. Her grandmother sat at the worn wooden table, hands folded, eyes sharp yet gentle. No accusations, no judgment. Just a single question, hanging in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Do you love him? Leila's breath caught. She could lie. She could pretend this was nothing more than a passing phase, a foolish mistake she would wake up from. But the truth was, she didn't know, because love had never been part of the plan. And now she wasn't sure if she had the strength to walk away. The envelope arrived the next evening, slipped beneath her door. No name, just the weight of expectation pressed into thick ivory paper. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the letter. And then, there it was, one simple line. "Don't run away. Meet me at the Imperial Hotel." No explanations, no pressure, just a choice that would change everything. And as she stood there, staring at the elegant curve of Richard's handwriting, Leila realized she had already made her decision. The rain had long since stopped, but the air still carried the cool scent of damp earth and lingering thunder. The Imperial Hotel stood tall against the dark sky, its lights casting golden reflections onto the wet pavement. Leila hesitated at the entrance, her fingers tightening around the folds of her coat. She had spent the entire day trying to talk herself out of coming, telling herself that this was reckless, that this wasn't her world, that she didn't belong. And yet, she was here. The thought of turning back crossed her mind, but deep down, she knew. Running was no longer an option. The elevator ride felt longer than it should have, each passing floor a countdown she wasn't sure she was ready for. When the doors slid open, she stepped into the dimly lit lounge of a private suite. Warm, intimate, with a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city. And there he was. Richard stood near the window, his reflection barely visible against the glass. His suit was immaculate, as always, but there was something different about him tonight. A tension in his shoulders, a hesitation in his stance, as if, for once, he wasn't entirely in control. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy but unbroken. Then, slowly, he turned. Their eyes met, and something inside her shifted, something unspoken, something inevitable. It was as if every moment between them had been leading to this. Every fight, every glance, every moment of stubborn defiance. This wasn't just attraction. This was something deeper, something terrifying, something real. And before she could stop herself, before doubt could creep in and steal the moment away, she crossed the room, reached for him, and pressed her lips against his. It wasn't soft. It wasn't hesitant. It was a collision of everything they had held back for too long. And when she pulled away, breathless, Richard was smiling. Not his usual effortless smirk, but something real, something relieved, as if he had been waiting for this all along. The following weeks passed in a blur. For the first time, they let themselves be something more. No longer tiptoeing around unspoken feelings, no longer pretending that what they had wasn't real. Leila had spent her entire life believing that love was a distraction, a luxury she couldn't afford. But Richard proved her wrong. Love wasn't a distraction. It was a foundation. And one evening, under the soft glow of string lights draped over the courtyard of their restaurant, Richard did something she never saw coming. The night was quiet, the air thick with the scent of roasted garlic and simmering spices. Their restaurant had closed for the evening, but the lingering warmth of laughter and clinking glasses still seemed to echo through the empty tables. Leila was wiping down the counter when she turned and found Richard standing there, watching her, an unreadable expression in his eyes. Before she could ask, he knelt. The small velvet box in his hand looked almost absurdly delicate in contrast to his usual air of unwavering confidence. Richard had always been the man with all the answers, the man who always knew what to say. But right now, he looked nervous, and that was how she knew. This was real. This wasn't grand gestures or calculated romance. This was him. Vulnerable, hopeful. Waiting, he whirled slowed as he spoke. And in that moment, everything, the battles they had fought, the doubts, the fears, they all faded. Because there was only one answer, and she had known it all along. Tears blurred her vision as she nodded. And just like that, forever began. There were no towering cakes, no grand ballrooms, no celebrity guests flown in from across the globe. Instead, the ceremony took place in the village where Leila had grown up, in the garden of her grandmother's home, beneath the same tree she had once played under as a child. The scent of jasmine filled the air, mingling with the distant sizzle of food being prepared by the very people who had supported them from the start. Richard, dressed in a crisp suit with the sleeves casually rolled up, stood at the altar. A simple wooden arch decorated with wildflowers gathered that morning. And then there was Leila. She walked toward him, barefoot in the grass, her dress flowing like whispered silk against her skin. There was no diamond-studded train, no glittering jewels, just her. Beautiful, uncomplicated, entirely herself. And when she reached him, when their hands found each other, there were no elaborate vows, no scripted promises, just truth. A promise made with no conditions, no expectations, just love. And when the officiant finally spoke the words that made them husband and wife, the entire village erupted into cheers. Laughter rang through the warm night air. Glasses clinked. Plates piled high with home-cooked meals were passed from hand to hand. And for the first time, Richard wasn't the CEO, and Leila wasn't the girl who had once doubted if she could ever fit into his world. They were just two people who had found their way home. To each other. Life didn't slow down after the wedding. The restaurant continued to thrive, filled with more than just customers. It was filled with a story. People didn't just come for the food. They came for the feeling, for the laughter that spilled from the kitchen, for the sight of Richard rolling up his sleeves to help with the dishes, for the way Leila still scolded him when he added too much salt to a recipe. They were still stubborn, still different in 100 little ways. But they were stronger together. Because love wasn't about wealth or power, it wasn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. Love was in the small things, the meals shared in the quiet hours of the night, the way their hands found each other under the table, the unspoken understanding that no matter what came next, they would face it together. And in the end, that was all that ever really mattered.